Hi, and welcome to my sci-fi, fantasy, and horror short fiction roundup for January 2022. And as usual, this roundup is also available to read online at my book blog, Maria's Reading. And there's a link in the description. And I'm going to launch right in because I've got a lot of stories to cover for this roundup. My first story pick is An Array of Worlds as a Rose Unfurling in Time by Shreya Ila Anasuya. And it's hopeful and it's infused with both love and magic. At its heart, it's a love story told out of sequence. And now the reason for this becomes clear in the story itself, as two lovers are being kept apart by their families and the world they live in, and yet they try to find a way to be together. It's a short story that truly feels like an epic love story, and the prose is just exquisite. My second story pick is also from Strange Horizons, also from December. It's Quaffer 7 by Kiran Kawarsaini. And this is another fabulous story that I missed, like I said, from December last year. Luckily, managed to catch up on it, again because it crossed my timeline on Twitter. This is a uniquely imagined and beautifully crafted science fiction story in palliative care, used to giving mostly short, easy-to-handle haircuts to new clients. But when Veena Kaur-chan interfaces with Quaffer 7, something unusual happens. Veena connects to the AI so intimately that it changes both Veena and the AI, and maybe even the palliative care system that they both inhabit. There's a beautiful tenderness here, and I love how the story switches back and forth between I to she to we as the interface between the AI and Veena changes and deepens. My next story pick is Memoirs of a Magic Mirror by Julia Knowles in Podcastle, and it's narrated by A.J. Fitzwater. And it starts out like this. It started when 3 magicians, 2 fairies, a couple of wizards, a witch, and 1 very drunken sage decided it was a good idea to give a question truthfully. Personally, I blame the alcohol. End quote. Now, if you know me, you know I have a thing for retellings of fairy tales. And here we get Snow White as seen from the point of view of the mirror itself. And Knowles pulls this off brilliantly by giving the mirror a very strong and forceful personality. And what happens when the stepmom/queen asks her famous question about who is the fairest of them all is a perfect example of why the story is so entertaining. There are other twists and turns in the story too, and I just love this take on the well-known story. My next story pick is Tadpole Prophecy by Avi Burton in Podcastle again, and this one's narrated by Sarah Griffin. This is a very sharp take on the chosen one trope in fantasy fiction. Burton tells this story from the point of view of the chosen one's sword, as the sword and the chosen one enter the Dark Lord's castle in order to take him down, just like the prophecies have foretold. But what happens in the Dark Lord's castle, and what has happened to the chosen one before that, is not your usual fantasy fodder. I love how this tale explores the problems of being chosen, and why someone, or a whole society, might want a person to believe they are chosen. This story reminded me of Summer Fletcher's excellent Why I Spared the One Brave Soul Between Me and My Undead Army at Cast of Wonders, so if you like this story, check that one out too. My next story pick is Lamia by Christina Gerardo in Apex Magazine, and this one was translated by Monica Luzon. And it's this is an awesome story. It's rich, it's twisted, and it's harrowing. This story about Lamia, who we first meet in a world that is fading and dying, where she is fading and dying, or so it seems, until her strange husband-to-be arrives and she becomes pregnant. But that's just where the darkness begins. This tale is marvelously dark and twisted as it delves ever deeper into horror, as we see Lamia's grief and loss, and eventually her transformation into something else, and into myth, monster, and legend. My next story pick is also from Apex Magazine. It's The Cure for Loneliness by M. Shaw. And this story is just deliciously trippy. It's about loneliness and pandemic isolation, and what happens when a philodendron cutting is put into a jar of pickle juice. Later, another cutting takes to some tequila. Shaw tells a story about relationships and the odd physical and emotional headspace people we find themselves in when cut off from other people and places that they were connected with in the before times. It's a pandemic story with a sense of humor and a lovely surrealistic vibe that includes a stuffed cat, an ex, and so many plants. I love the unsettling, slightly off-kilter feel of the story, where reality is growing and changing in unexpected ways. My next story pick is also from Clarkesworld. It's my next story pick is from Clarkesworld. It's The Language Birds Speak by Rebecca Campbell. Now, I finally got around to reading this novelette. I love Campbell's work, and this one is just harrowing and magical. Gracie, in the story, knows that her son, Alex, is not a regular child. His speech is delayed, and when he does speak, the words are strange, not like any language Gracie knows, though it also seems oddly familiar to her. The words Alex speaks also seem to affect the world and other people in unexpected ways, and once Gracie sets off to try to figure out what is going on with her son, things get deeper and stranger and more dangerous than she could have imagined. This is a really well-told story where the line between science and magic become blurred and eventually indistinguishable. My next story is also from Clarkesworld. This is Bishop's Opening by R.S.A. Garcia. Like I said, it's from Clarkesworld. Now, this story, oh my goodness. Space romance, space battles, spaceships, space food, space shenanigans. I cannot overemphasize how rich and spectacularly entertaining this science fiction novella is. Garcia has become a must-read author for me. She's a marvelous storyteller and world builder, and here she weaves together a glorious romp of courtly intrigue, love and lust, and old family troubles coming home to roost. It's the kind of story that sucks you in and keeps you hooked. And if you want more by Garcia, I also recommend her novella, Philia, Eros, Storge, Agape, Pragma, also from Clarkesworld. My next story pick is Clay by Isabel J. Kim in Beneath Ceaseless Skies. And I'm going to read a quote from this story. The clay that makes bodies is found underneath the fissure basin. If you dig past the white sand, there is dark clay below. It dries to a pale finish when fired. There is no chemical difference between the clay that makes bodies and the clay that doesn't. So, we find ourselves in a world where people are crafted from clay rather than born. And here, Emmanuel 7.18 works as a courier. He was damaged in the kiln when he was made and was deemed unfit for the kind of work he was originally created for. His courier work brings him to Abe's store one day. Now, Abe is not like anyone else Emmanuel has met, and his work with clay is about making bodies by hand rather than in a factory. This story is quietly harrowing, but not without hope, as it draws us into the strangeness and the hidden wounds and pains of its world. My next story pick is In the Beginning of Me, I Was a Bird by Maria Dong in Lightspeed. And the beautiful strangeness of this piece is just enchanting. There is an alien invasion happening where seeds fall from the skies, penetrating humans. And when the humans die after this, their consciousness can then move into new creatures to escape death. Two souls, lack of a better word, chase and follow each other through the tale, through the world, from Starbucks to an apartment to the deep seas. Now, Dong's prose is gorgeous, and this is the kind of enigmatic alien presence that I really like in science fiction. My next story pick is Shadows of the Hungry, the Broken, the Transformed by Izzy Wasserstein in Cosmos Infinities. Now, in the story, Justine has lost her shadow after suffering a devastating loss. She's trying to go on with her life, talking to others who have also lost their shadows, but the loss and grief of what's happened is interfering with her studies of the delicate magic of heart weaving. Wasserstein's piercing story captures so many shades of grief and love and sorrow, and also shows how difficult it can be to find a way to live our lives when we have been fundamentally changed by loss. My next story pick is The Long Way Up by Alex E. Harrow in The Deadlands. Don't miss this story. When her husband dies in an accident, Ocean cannot get over it and move on like all her therapists and friends tell her to do. Instead, she goes on a long journey to get him back. But when she finally finds him, at the end of that long travail, nothing turns out the way Ocean thought. Harrow's story, with its beating heart and its dark sense of humor and its clear-eyed depiction of grief and trauma and love, strikes a deep chord. If you have gone down to hell to find a loved one, and if you have faced the truths you find there, you'll know the truth of this story. My next story pick is It Takes a Village by L. Chan in Ogre Magazine 4.2. This is such a great, deeply unsettling and disturbing tale about a judge headed to a village to investigate a crime. But this is no ordinary village. It's populated by dolls, artificial humans created to serve their human owners. And as the judge enters the village of the dolls, he soon realizes that he might be in way over his head. This is a beautifully crafted tale where nothing is as it seems, and where the darkness beneath the surface gets ever deeper and ever more dangerous. My next story pick is Every Quivering Fold of Flesh by Jennifer R. Donahue in The Future Fire. In the story, the carcass of a very strange creature has washed up on the beach in a small community, and 3 friends have gathered for a beach party right next to the remains. It's a story about transformations, and it captures the confusion and heady excitement of adolescence and friendship and change, and of growing up in a small community and looking for a way to be and become yourself. And all of it is woven together with such skill and such darkness that I just find it irresistible. My next story pick is Markets, A Beginner's Guide by Shalini Srinivasan in Fantasy Magazine. This is a rich and subtly layered story where the real world of grief and adolescence, loss and friendship is intimately woven together with an unsettling, though not necessarily sinister, magic of banyan trees. In the story, we meet Lavanya. Her mother is sick, dying slowly. One day, a stranger comes to the door, and Lavanya knows immediately that he is perilous. The dead rose man went deader and rosier, and his ear hair curled into long, dry blood tendrils. Roots, maybe, ends tender and pink, They twisted in and around and replaced his eyes in a way that made Lamia feel dizzy. Magic lurks everywhere in the story, and it, in the form of the dead Rose Man, comes calling every year as Lamia grows up, as her life and her body and her friends change. The magic calls to her, but she resists, at least for a long while. I love how this story delves into the relationships, games, and everyday rituals among friends, and how it captures the way friendships change through adolescence and how painful and confusing that change can be. The emotional depth of the story and the subtle way the magic creeps ever closer to Lamia sets this story apart. My next story pick is From Earth to Io with Love by Adelhin Ijasan in Faya. Here's a story that will be haunting me for a while, just like a good episode of The Twilight Zone. It's a science fiction story about a teleportation trip from Earth to Io. And it starts out as if it's setting up a sci-fi adventure, perhaps. But the sharp turn it takes into horror is brilliantly done. I literally gasped reading this, and I love the nightmarish vibe. The story is part of a fantastic issue of Faya magazine that is well worth your time to check out. My next story pick is To Make Unending by Max Gladstone in The Sunday Morning Transport. The Sunday Morning Transport is a new speculative short fiction venue set to publish one news story every week, and this was their first ever story. Gladstone gives us a high fantasy tale with a definite Tolkien feel, but with a difference. We find ourselves in a world where the high elf children play a version of D&D, where the game involves playing a version of our human world, sending emails instead of questing, figuring out office politics instead of fighting orcs, so on. It's a clever twist, and Gladstone uses it to explore how parents might always worry that their kids are wasting their time on frivolous pursuits, and how those kids can surprise them with their skill and abilities in the end. My next story pick is Thermophile by Jack Klausner in the Dark. Oh, it's such a quietly disturbing, creepingly surreal horror tale about two roommates and the ever stranger behavior one of them exhibits as his love for long, very long hot showers, goes beyond an annoyance into the realm of transformation. I love how this story is so firmly anchored in the real world and then peels back our reality bit by bit until we are in the realm of true body horror. My next story pick is Factory Mother by Sid Jain in Cast of Wonders. It's narrated by Nadia Nias. I love this slice of life and slice of science story. We find ourselves in a future where the world has been ravaged by nuclear fallout and more. Hanifa's ravaged family has had to leave India behind and now live in a sort of refugee town in the US. Hanifa has a job in a plant manufacturing mushroom-based protein, and her life and her work are crushing her in a multitude of ways. I love how Jain portrays Hanifa's workplace and her home situation with such gentle precision, and I love to read a story like this, where the plot revolves around everyday life. And you can pair this story with Mist Songs of Delhi by the same author, which is narrated by Amal Singh. My next story pick is The Elements of Herself by Kiyomi Appleton Gaines in Nightmare. This is a gorgeous, evocative, deeply unsettling take on the tale of the bamboo cutter. If you've seen the beautiful and devastating animated movie The Tale of the Princess Kaguya, you'll have seen one take on that story. In Kiyomi Appleton Gaines's version of the story, things twist and turn in new ways, and the ending packs a severe emotional punch. My next story is also from Nightmare. It's New Meat by Jordan Shively. This is an outstanding flash fiction story, and it's so voracious and tense, and it just quivers with hunger and dread. And the prose just makes me feel like the prose makes the whole story feel like a taut string ready to snap. My next story pick is Worrywort by Effie, Sayberg, and Galaxy's Edge. I do so love this story. It's about a very curious and rather hilarious fairy gift that has been bugging the ever-living crap out of its recipient forever. What would it be like to have your anxiety by your side as a living, breathing, speaking creature that questions your every move, telling you all the things you fear are true? That's what this story imagines what that would be like, and it is funny, it's sharp, and it pulls off an excellent ending as well. And my final story pick for this roundup is Pod 530217-A, and it's by Emma Lindhagen in Baffling Magazine. And I love the opening line is, "On Thursday, I am killing Mix Clark." Now, this story asks the question, what does the future have in store for people who choose to be cryogenically frozen in our time, hoping to be resurrected in some distant future? That question has been explored in several works of science fiction, of course, and I love Lindhagen's quietly devastating take on what might happen to those people that have themselves frozen when the future has moved beyond whatever expectations and hopes those people and their families once cherished. I love the way Lindhagen approaches this subject and the way there is still light and humanity even at the end of the road. And that was all my story picks for this month's roundup. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll be back next month. Thank you so much.